Welcome to the Ghostly Gallery podcast. It's a place where we explore the world of horror in film, television, books, and popular culture. Hello, everyone. My name is Bruce Markison, and as always, I'm joined by producer and co host Tracy Asteria. Normally, I begin the program by asking Tracy how you're doing. I know you're not doing that great because you have been through a monster of a winter weather storm. Tell us about it.
Oh, monster is a really good term. Um, we're calling it Snowmageddon, possibly. it it's been a nightmare the last 3 days. I live in northern Nova Scotia, and we have had over 5 feet of snow in a 3 day time span. And there are pockets of snowdrifts that are 7 to 12 feet high in the neighborhood. So
Wow.
it's been a wacky, tiring, Advil induced 3 days.
It's amazing you're with us tonight.
I'm here in spirit.
Yeah. Well, we're glad you're safe and you're okay and that it finally did stop snowing there. Here where I
Yes.
live, it has been a surprisingly mild winter. And also, I guess it's pretty mild right now for our guest, who I'm going to introduce. Our guest this week is a friend of ours. He's a writer, blogger, Hammer Films enthusiast, Dan Day. Dan writes the Hitless Wonder movie blog. We'll tell you about that later. He has also worked for years as a volunteer at the annual Monster Bash conference in Pennsylvania. It's one of the best horror conventions in the country, really well run, and Dan's part of that. And at Monster Bash, Dan has gotten to know a number of actors and actresses. We'll talk about some of the friendships he's developed there. Dan, welcome to the Ghostly Gallery. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me here. I do want to say one thing. I've never actually been a volunteer at Monster Bash. I've been a attendee. That's basically more of an accurate description.
Oh, okay. Well, you are a big part of what goes on there. I've been to, I think, three Monster Bashes, and I'm always impressed by how organized, how well done everything is. Ron Adams is the man who heads it up and really does a fine job. This year's Monster Bash is going to be a little bit later than normal. It's going to be in July, July 19th to the 21st, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we proceed. So, Dan, with a lot of our guests, we like to ask them about how they first became interested in horror. For you, when did that happen? Was it a specific film or a TV show or a book? Tell us about that.
Well, I guess really everything sort of goes back to Star Wars, which I saw when I was like 8 years old. I'm an original Star Wars fan. I was absolutely obsessed with that film. I mean that's the film that made me an overall film buff. And when you're a kid at that age, 8, 9, 10, whatever, you're into science fiction and horror and monsters. And speaking of Hammer Films, which we will be speaking of, at that time when I first saw Star Wars, like I said, I was absolutely obsessed with everything about it. And of course, back then you didn't have the internet. You had toys and trading cards and stuff like that. But this was the late 1970s, and at that time, Carrie Fisher, Harrison Ford, Mark Hamill, they hadn't really made a lot of films. And what they did make were films that, as me as a kid, I wasn't all that interested in. But I found out that Peter Cushing, who was, of course, in Star Wars, he made all these monster movies and all these science fiction movies. So that's when I started watching them. I started, anything science fiction, anything horror, monsters. That's what I was getting into as a little kid, and I was a huge fan of Svengoolie. And of course, Svengoolie now is nationally known through MeTV. But in the 1980s, when I really started watching him, he was out of Chicago, a UHF station called Channel 32. Anyone who's in the Midwest and the Great Lakes area will recognize that. That was in my opinion, the golden age of Svengoolie because he showed everything. I mean, he showed Universal, he showed Hammer, American International, Toho. That was my film school. People ask me, how come you know so much about old movies? Well, I went to the University of Svengoolie, basically, but that's really where I saw these movies for the very first time.
So,
And that
Tracy, Dan is one of you, Star Wars. That is right up your alley.
Yep, Star Wars and Star Trek, absolutely. Those are amazing.
Yeah, back then, Channel 32, they not only showed Svengoolie, they showed Star Trek and Lost in Space and you know, Channel 9 out of Chicago. They showed Twilight Zone. I watched all that stuff when I was a kid. So that was basically my education right there. If it was like science fiction, weird monsters, that's what I watched. I was a geek before that term even came into being.
Yeah.
So
Now, Dan, he was not the original Svengoolie. There was another guy that came before him. Did you watch
yeah,
those?
that was way before my time. There was a Svengoolie in the early 1970s, and every once in a while I still refer to Sven as the son of Svengoolie because that's the moniker he went under in the 1980s.
Yeah.
That's what I knew him as, and the story goes in the 1990s. Rich Coase, that's the guy who's really Svengoolie. The original Svengoolie told him he when Son of Svengoolie, or the Svengoolie now, came back in the 1990s on another UHF station out of Chicago, the original Svengoolie said, "Well, I think you're old enough. You don't have to call yourself the son of Svengoolie." So he became Svengoolie. But yeah, when I was watching him, he was the son of Svengoolie.
Yeah. Sometimes I'll post on Saturdays what Svengoolie's movie of the week is. And sometimes we'll get a critical comment from somebody saying they don't like him. He's too corny. The jokes aren't funny.
Oh
That's the
yeah,
whole thing. That's it's meant to be
no,
corny. It's
it's
meant to be silly.
and the thing of it is, and of course I'm biased towards the guy because I've been literally watching him basically my entire life, and that's where I saw all these movies for the very first time. So there's that kind of magic element when you see something for the very first time, where you see it at, it means much more to you. But if you really look at Svengoolie and watch the show, yeah, he does have corny jokes but he grew up in the era of classic television
Hmm.
where that was the type of humor. It wasn't social humor or political humor. It wasn't humor to be sarcastic or to show off how smart you are. It was just everyday mainstream everybody, that type of humor with it. It appeals to everyone because that's what classic television did, because of course back then you only had three networks,
Yeah.
and that was what it was geared for. It wasn't geared to make anybody angry or make anybody feel left out. And once again, you watch the shows, he's wants you to laugh with him. He doesn't want you to, he points certain things out in the movie. Yes, I mean, I'm I usually take part in the what is called the Sven tweetathon.
Yeah.
A bunch of people go on Twitter or X or whatever you call it now, and we tweet during the show. We put in our own little jokes and we make fun of the movies, but at the same time, if it wasn't for Svengoolie, especially now, I mean, think about this. He's showing movies from the 1930s sometimes on a primetime slot Saturday night, and he's getting pretty decent ratings
Oh yeah.
compared to what's going out there. So I think if you're a film buff, instead of being offended that this guy made a joke about this movie, you should appreciate the fact that he's showing these films, and MeTV is nationwide now.
Oh yeah.
He's allowing these films to be shown by people, and a lot of people probably would have never seen these films unless he didn't show them.
Absolutely. He's carrying on the tradition. Dan, one of my favorite parts of his show is when he comes up with a song.
Oh yeah,
That I think is hysterical. I think that is really funny.
and he writes the show. I mean, that he's been doing that for years and years, and he's the only one that. I mean, for the most part, I think there's a little bit more people help him now that he's with MeTV. But when I was watching him back in the 1980s, what I really loved about it had this kind of ragged, off the wall, you know, we're making this up as we go along type of quality.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, if you go on YouTube, there's a lot of clips of him back in the 1980s. And once again, that to me I think, is his golden period. I'm not saying I don't like what he's doing now, but the show that he does now is a bit more polished. It's a bit more mainstream, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
It's I mean, it's still funny, but in the 1980s, I mean, he was just doing all sorts of like crazy weird things. If you ever seen the film UHF with Weird Al Yankovic, that's literally
Right.
what Svengoolie was back in those days.
Right.
And it
Yeah.
was hilarious. And for a kid like me, you got this crazy guy doing all this funny stuff, and he's showing, all these old monster movies that I was getting into. I mean, that was like Nirvana for me.
Yeah, you're right. It's a little more scripted now. There's more editing. There's more pre-production.
Yeah.
But I think it's fun. My family thinks I'm crazy. My daughter walks in and rolls her eyes at the material. But maybe it's an acquired taste. But I guess we both have it. One last question on him, Dan. Have you ever met him?
Oh yeah, I've met him about 3 or 4 times.
Yeah.
He does a lot of conventions in Chicago, and whenever he does a convention, trust me, the people just line up for. I mean, he literally has to cut people. They have to cut the lines off. He has to tell people, I'm only going to be here like a certain amount of time, because
Yeah.
he fills the place. I mean, he's an icon, especially in the Midwest.
Seems like a good guy.
Oh yeah, he is. He's a pretty decent guy.
Yeah. Dan, let's talk a little bit about how you became involved with Monster Bash because you're originally from Chicago. I believe you mentioned that you live now in South Bend.
Well,
So,
actually, I was born in South Bend.
oh, you were born in South Bend.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And you're still
I
there.
spent plenty of time in Chicago, but yeah, I was born in South Bend. I basically lived in the South Bend area for most of my life.
Okay. So, how does a guy from the Midwest end up becoming such a loyal part of Monster Bash, which is in Pennsylvania? You make that long trek every year.
Yeah, it's for me. It's not really too bad a trek, because it's about 5 6 hours depending on how fast I go. Because basically all I have to do is get on the Indiana Toll Road, which is not that far from me. The toll road turns into the Ohio Turnpike, which turns into the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And the area where they hold Monster Bash, they've held it at a couple different hotels, but it's literally like right off of the exit is right off the turnpike. So it's a
Yeah.
pretty easy drive. But I had been going to conventions in Chicago. I've been to C2E2, the Flashback Weekend convention in Chicago, G Fest, which is the Godzilla convention, and I had always, for whatever reason, I just hadn't made it out to Monster Bash, and it was 2013, I believe, the summer Monster Bash. That was the first Monster Bash I went to, and that was where I first met Veronica Carlson. I think Donnie Dunnigan, I think, was there. I think John Saxon was there. I
Really?
met Greg Mank for the first time, and it just blew me away, because you're seeing all these people. Greg Mank, I've been reading his books since I was a teenager, and there he is, and he's talking to you.
Yeah.
And being a Hammer fan, I had never met anyone that was actually connected with Hammer, and to meet Veronica Carlson, that was like meeting the Queen. That was like meeting royalty. So that was the beginning of it all, and I've been going basically ever since. I think I've missed a couple of the fall bashes, and of course they didn't have one in 2020. But what I really love about Monster Bash and what Ron and his team do, like I said, I've been to a lot of the bigger conventions in Chicago and in Indianapolis, because I'm basically about as far away from Indy as I am from Chicago. And the bigger conventions, especially now, it's like it just stresses you out. You spend most of your time standing in line. You got to figure out who you're going to go see, and the cost of everything has gotten to be ridiculous. The autograph cost is in, you're paying 50, 60, $70, and you're lucky if the person you're getting the autograph from even looks at you. And at Monster Bash, it's much more down home. It's much more of a community type of thing, and you get a chance to actually interact with people,
Yeah.
not the guests, the writers and the artists that are there. It's much more fun. It's much more homey, I guess you could say.
I want to talk a little bit about what you've done at Monster Bash. You mentioned that you're not a volunteer, but you kind of help out the actors and actresses and make sure that their needs are attended to. So you're pretty active with this.
Well, I was kind of helping out Veronica the last time she was there, and I've helped out Josh Kennedy with some things. Um, yeah, I'm more basically just a regular attendee, so
Yeah.
they know who I am basically. But that's the other great thing about Monster Bash. Everybody, you when you go there, it's getting the point now. When I go there, it's not so much to actually get autographs or buy stuff. It's just to see people.
Hmm.
I mean, I talk to them or interact with them on the internet, but to actually see them, in real life, It's almost like a family reunion in a sense.
Yeah. Let's talk more about Veronica Carlson. You were the one who introduced me to her. I met her just a few months actually before she passed away, and we were all stunned to hear the news of her passing. It was
Yeah.
2 years ago, February of 2022. But I could tell the two of you, you really were true friends. You were very close.
Yeah. It's kind of hard for me to even talk about her without getting, she was a good friend to me. And where that started, I had met her before at Monster Bashes, and I was given the fantastic opportunity by Josh Kennedy to be a part of his film House of the Gorgon,
Hmm.
which he shot in March of 2018 down in Texas, where he lives, Edinburgh, Texas, which is almost right on the border. And he got Caroline Munro, Martine Beswick, Veronica Carlson, and Christopher Neame, who was in Dracula AD 1972. He got them all to be in this film and to come to Texas. And he enabled me to be a part of that. And it was an incredible experience, a very hectic experience because it was all in 1 week,
Hmm.
which is not something I think Josh really wanted, but that's just how the way it worked out. And like I said, I had met Veronica before. Obviously, she's not going to remember every person that she meets at a convention because she did a number of them. And the first day I was down there, everybody kind of like took a break from the filming, and the filming was at a banquet hall, like an event center. And Veronica was just sitting there all by herself at a table, getting something to eat. And I asked, "Do you mind if I sit down next to you?" And she's, "No, no, please." And I started talking to her, and the next thing you know, we became friends. And that's, I mean, that's once again, you I was this nerdy kid watching Dracula has risen from the grave for the very first time on Svengoolie in like 1985, and if you had told me, "Oh yeah, that beautiful blonde there, she's going to be your friend," I'm
Yeah.
like, "There's no way," but it happens. So
Yeah. Well, I could tell she was the kind of person that it didn't matter if you were a celebrity or not a celebrity. She was open to being cordial and friendly and accepting. And that's one of the great things I love about the horror community is that so many of the actors and actresses are like that. And I think Veronica really embodied that. She was outstanding in those two Hammer films. You mentioned Dracula has risen from the grave, and then Frankenstein must be destroyed. Tell us a little bit more about being on the set of House of the Gorgon and what that was like.
well, once again, Josh Kennedy, the esteemed Josh Kennedy, or I like to call him the Orson Welles of Edinburgh. He got this event center. I cannot remember the name of it. I'm sorry, recreation center, because once again, this is like down near the border near Mexico, and Mexican Americans, they do a lot of festivals, they do a lot of personal events, family wise. They're very much into family, so that's one of the reasons the center is there, so they can all get together. And the center had, obviously public bathrooms and restrooms and that sort of thing. And Josh was able to, with some of the people that helps him out in his movies, he was able to take certain sections of the center and actually make them into sets.
Hmm.
So he basically had everything he really needed. And it was just, I helped him out any way I could. It wasn't like I was, a professional filmmaker or anything like that. I just did the best I could. But every once in a while, I just had to sort of stop myself and think, there's Caroline Munro and there's Martine Beswick and there's Veronica Carlson, and
Yeah.
they're making a movie, and I'm watching this. It was absolutely amazing because they never, and this includes Christopher Neame, none of them ever acted like this is beneath me, or they never treated anybody like, who are you, or
Yeah.
they were just totally into it. And a lot of that goes back to Josh. If you've ever met Josh Kennedy, or if you know him or know him from his films, he has this love of genre cinema, of classic genre cinema, and he just loves creating and making the films that he makes, he could probably get a job in Hollywood or New York City or wherever, but that's not what he wants to do. He wants to do the projects that he believes in.
Hmm.
And he has such a fantastic way of expressing himself, and just his creativity and his positivity and his enthusiasm. That Veronica constantly told me how much she loved Josh and loved working with him, and she wanted to work with him again. The way Veronica phrased it to me was, when we all get back together again. And what she meant by that is everybody in the house, the group that worked on House of the Gordon, Caroline Monroe, Martine Beswick. She always said, when we get back together again. She never said, if we get back together again. That was the one thing she really, really wanted to do, was to work with Josh again and to see Caroline and Martine again in real life,
Yeah.
because they corresponded, of course.
Right.
And unfortunately, Josh had planned to go to England, and we were all going to go to England in 2020. And well, unfortunately, that never handed out.
Yeah. Pandemic interfered with real life. I saw House of the Gorgon when it was screened at Monster Bash. I really didn't expect much going in, and then I came away after seeing it and said, "This is pretty darn good." I mean, he didn't have much money to work with.
No.
It's really an overachieving film, and he let these actors kind of do their thing, which is a smart thing to do when you have veteran actors like Monroe and Beswick and Neem and of course Veronica Carlson. It's a pretty good movie. Really came out well.
Well, I'm definitely going to tell him that you said that.
Yeah.
No, I once again, he only had a week, and that has to do with the fact that the stars could only be there for a certain amount of time. Because Caroline and Martine live in England. I believe Christopher Neame lives in New York, and Veronica lived in South Carolina.
Yeah.
And I think Josh could only have the event center for about a week, and he was kind of he was pretty wore out at the end of all of that.
I'm sure.
But it was definitely worth it, and I know he's going to be annoyed by me bringing this up again, but he really does need to put that on Blu-ray, and hopefully he will. It's, I don't know if I should say this or not, but tentatively, I think they're going to show it again at the Fall Monster Bash. So,
Okay.
because I know people keep on asking me, well, can I get this on Blu-ray? Can I get this on streaming? Can I get? And he only made so many DVDs, and they're all gone.
Yeah.
So it has been shown on British television. There's, I think it's a network called Talking Pictures TV out of Britain.
Yeah.
It's kind of like MeTV, and Caroline Monroe hosts a show, and they show Monster, and she's almost like a Svengoolie in a way,
Yeah.
and they actually showed it a couple times. So
Well, the year that it was screened at Monster Bash, Caroline Monroe was supposed to be there, but she was ill
yeah,
and couldn't make it, so I never had a chance to meet her. Tell us what Carolyn Monroe's like.
she's just an absolute sweetheart. I mean, she really is. I mean, she's just absolutely nicest person in the world. It, just she's it's you don't, you think that they're going to have some kind of attitude, or at least something, or I mean, because just like Veronica, she was an absolutely gorgeous woman, and she still is, but she is just an absolute sweetheart. Now Martine's a sweetheart too, but Martine definitely has she still acts like a teenager. So
Yeah.
Martine has a bit more of a spunk, I should say, than the other two ladies. It was great watching them all interact with each other, and how their personalities were. It was really fun.
I saw Martine speak at, I think it was that year's Monster Bash as well. And she talked about working on the film, which is a really good movie, Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde.
Yeah,
And she had to deal with a director, Roy Baker, I believe is his
yeah.
name.
Roy Ward Baker.
Yeah, he was not an easy man to work for. He wanted her to, I guess, be topless in some scenes and do some things that she was really not anticipating, and I guess she at one point kind of walked out on the set until they could renegotiate better terms. She really stood up to him.
Yeah, Martine is somebody you don't want to be in her bad side or mess with her. She's definitely a very um, straightforward, tell it like it is person. Like I said, she's wonderful to be with, but she's definitely going to stand up for herself. She has that definite spunk. When you see her on the screen, when you see her like fighting Raquel Welch or in 1 Million Years BC or in some of the other movies, she definitely has a strong personality.
Yeah. And then the other actor from that film, House of the Gorgon, Christopher Neame. I met
Hmm.
him and complimented him on his work in the movie. And he was great in Dracula AD 1972,
Oh
played
yeah,
Johnny
I think
Alucard.
yeah, I think that's one of the best Hammer for performances. And there's some Hammer fans that think, oh, he's just way over the top. But look at it this way: he's in a film with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. If he
Right.
didn't play it that way, he would have gotten just blown out of the water. I mean, he just took it and ran with it. And once again, you have to take it into the context. It was made in the early 1970s, so that's I think where he was. And I'm sure when he was on that film, he's probably thinking to himself, I got to deal with Cushing and Lee. I don't think he was trying to compete with them, but at the
Mhm.
same time, he had to do something to make that character stand out.
What's he like?
It was interesting about Christopher Neame. I really didn't get a chance to talk to him or interact with him all that much because he was so into his role on House of the Gorgon. He would go off by himself and he
Mhm.
would just kind of like stay away from everybody. And he wasn't being mean or being unsocial. It's just that's how he was as an actor. That's how he prepared as an actor, and that really impressed me because once again, this is a movie where some people might say, or some people have said, "Oh, it's got no money. It's not like an official film," and he took it absolutely dead serious. I mean, he would, somebody would say, "Well, where's Chris at?" "Oh, well, he's off, kind of meditating and thinking about what he's going to do and preparing himself." And I was like, that wow,
Yeah.
that's something. Yeah, you expect it if you're making $100 million film or you're doing Shakespeare on Broadway or something. But and he wasn't doing it as like a joke or trying to show off. That was just his way as an actor of preparing.
Yeah, it's a sign of a true professional. You put
Yeah.
100% effort into the film, no matter whether it's big budget or small budget, no matter what your salary might be. Bela Lugosi was like that. Whether the films were good or not, Bela always gave everything that he had. The effort was there, and a lot of times his performances would shine above what the film itself might have been. You mentioned earlier, Dan, that you had a chance to meet John Saxon, I guess, at your first Monster Bash. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, I asked him about Mario Bava, and he just like brightened up. He's like, Mario Bava, oh man, well, he was something, and he was talking about how when John Saxon, when he worked in Italy for a time, and he talked about how he was driving around the sports car and he was enjoying La Dolce Vita, and just how great it was to work in Italy, and what a innovative person Mario Bava was. I didn't talk to Mr. Saxon a lot. I mean, that's the one thing at Monster Bash. You don't want to take up too much of the time of these people because there's always somebody behind you,
Yeah.
and it's kind of rude to just you know take over somebody's time. But I did was able to talk to him a little bit about Mario Bava. So I thought, I mean, and John Saxon, if you watch MeTV, I think he shows up at least once a week on one of those TV shows they have. He was in
Yeah.
everything in the 1970s,
Yeah.
all sorts of TV shows and movies. I mean, he was in High Plains Drifter with Clint Eastwood. But
Right.
I love the fact that I met somebody that actually worked with Mario Bava. I mean, that's unfortunately nowadays that's an extremely rare thing.
He was in a lot of great horror films. Black Christmas. He was in the first Nightmare on Elm Street.
Yeah.
He also did a lot of non-horror films too, like you mentioned. He was in Enter the Dragon with Bruce
Hmm.
Lee. I mean, that must have been an amazing experience. His characters were always so hard-edged, and you can't help when you see an actor in those roles again and again, you think, well, maybe that's how they are in real life. Was it intimidating at all to meet him, thinking that he might be
No,
like those
he was
characters?
very personable, and he seemed happy to be there. And like I said, he would talk to anybody or something if you'd ask him a question. I think what brightened him up about me talking about Mario Bava is I think most of the people there were talking to him about the main stuff, Enter the Dragon and High Plains Drifter. And I think the fact that I said something about Mario Bava, he
Yeah,
was like, "Oh wow," so he's asking me a question about Mario Bava. So that's always, I think. I mean, when you meet somebody like that, obviously the first thing that comes to your mind is the most famous thing they did or the most famous role they have. I've gotten enough conventions and met enough of these people that I think if you ask them something, I wouldn't say off kilter or off center, but if you ask them about a movie or a TV show that they usually don't get to talk about, they brighten up really quick.
sure. Any other actors or actresses that you've met at Monster Bash who really left a mark with you?
I'm trying to think because I've met so many. I met I met Julie Adams, which was absolutely amazing, and she was really really nice. Um, but the thing of it was because there were so many people at her table, I didn't want to. Once again, I didn't want to be that guy who just stands there and just goes on because you have people behind you who want to meet her too. So I didn't get a chance to really really discuss her career or anything. Here's a story that I know you'll appreciate, Bruce. I met Patrick Wayne a couple of years ago, and when I went up to his table, Patrick Wayne, the son of John Wayne,
Mm.
I was wearing my usual Monster Bash uniform, which is a Peter Cushing shirt and a White Sox hat. And he looks at the shirt and he goes, "Nice shirt." And I'm like, "Oh, wow, Patrick Wayne likes Peter Cushing." And he looks at my hat and he starts talking about baseball because Patrick Wayne is a Dodgers fan. And I had all these questions I wanted to ask him about, his dad, Jimmy Stewart, Maureen O'Hara, and I never got a chance to do it because we spent 10 minutes talking about Major League Baseball,
Wow.
which I guess is pretty cool. I mean, how many times can you say you talk baseball with John Wayne's son? So
It's funny you mentioned that. One of the first people I met at Monster Bash was Victoria Price, daughter of the
and I
legendary
have spoken
Vincent
about
Price.
baseball with Victoria
Yeah.
Price.
She likes baseball better than horror. She at one
Oh yeah.
point, I told her I worked at the Hall of Fame and we were trying to work something out where she would come up and visit, and it didn't quite work out that way, but she was really into baseball, still is, and she said
Hmm.
her father was a huge fan too, which I did not know.
Yes. Yeah, and her biography of her father, which I have, and I got her to sign at the Monster Bash. She told all these stories about going to Dodgers games and how I guess when her father was near the end of his life, Vincent Price, when he was really ill and sort of bedridden, he was the one thing he would do would listen to the Dodger games on the radio and listen to Vin Scully.
Mm.
So when I met Victoria Price and Josh Kennedy was with me, I started talking baseball with her, and we just talked, for about 5-10 minutes. And after we left the table, Josh looked at me and he goes, "I cannot believe you spent all that time talking Major League Baseball with Vincent Price's daughter." I said, "Well, Josh, that's, that sport." I mean, because Josh is not a sports fan. And I said, sometimes, sports opens up a lot more doors than you think.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Dan, you mentioned a few moments ago Julie Adams, who, of course, was one of the stars from Creature from the Black Lagoon. We're coming up on the 70th anniversary of that film here in February of 2024. One of the people that was a regular, at least a couple of times that he was at Monster Bash, was Rico Browning, who just passed away
Yes.
last year. Did you ever meet Rico?
Yeah, I did. I met him. He was he's a nice guy, very very quiet. He wasn't shall we say um very talkative, but I mean, he was a decent, decent guy. I talked to him a little bit. I told him because my dad lives in Fernandina Beach, Florida, Amelia Island. I asked him if he'd ever been there because, and of course, oh yeah, he knew all about it because I think that was his Rico Browning's base was Florida. Because I think if you know about Rico Browning, I think he had his own little production film company where he would do underwater shots for people because I believe he did the underwater stuff for Thunderball.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
he was a
I
phenomenal swimmer, and he actually did a program at Monster Bash, and his recall of events from almost 7 decades ago was pretty darn amazing. Was I had never met him, but I did get a chance to see him speak, and to see the last of the Universal monsters. He was the last surviving
Mhm.
monster from those great films. That was
Yeah.
really a thrill. It really was.
Yeah, and that's the great thing about Monster Bash is you're meeting people, and sadly a lot of the people that I've met at Monster Bash have since passed away, and that's why I understand with economics and everything, especially the way things are going on in the world right now. Some people just aren't able to make it to these conventions, but I always tell people if you can do it, do it, because unfortunately you never know. You may never get a chance to meet these type of people ever again.
Absolutely. Now, a particular interest to you, Dan, are Hammer films, which, of course, were a real staple in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Hammer first delved into horror and sci fi with the 1955 movie The Quatermass Experiment. And then it really kind of turned to classic horror with its release of The Curse of Frankenstein, which came out in 1957. And then after that, they did horror of Dracula. And with Curse of Frankenstein, this was Hammer really delving into those old black and white classics from Universal, offering their own interpretations. They would film them in full color and put some variety of twists and turns into the plots. And the end result was really a series of some well done, stylized films in the 50s, the 60s, and 70s. And you particularly like a lot of these movies, and I wanted to get your thoughts on some of your favorite Hammer productions. We're going to talk about four that you indicated you really liked. We're going to start with the least known of the four, an underrated movie which came out in 1966, Plague of the Zombies.
Yeah, when people think of zombies nowadays, obviously it's George Romero and The Walking Dead and that sort of thing. Plague of the Zombies is very interesting because it's set in what I call Hammerland, which is this 19th century. It's either England or Central Europe. Even if it is in Europe, everybody has a British accent. It doesn't, everybody looks British. Nobody looks Central European. But that's the whole thing about Hammer is that you buy into it. I mean, you don't nitpick it. You just accept it for what it is. That's what makes Hammer Hammer. It's the same sets, this Bray Studios, Black Park, the forest that the carriages always go through. But that's what Hammer fans love, is to watch that stuff over and over again and see the same thing. But Plague of the Zombies is really great. It was directed by John Gilling. He's not as famous as Terrence Fisher or Freddie Francis, but John Gilling directed a number of Hammer films and non-Hammer horror films that are actually very good. The best Burke and Hare movie, in my opinion, was The Flesh and the Fiends. It's has a couple of other titles as well. That was not a Hammer film, but it stars Peter Cushing as Dr. Knox. That was directed, I believe, is also written by John Gilling.
Hmm.
Yeah, he was a very good craftsman. Like I said, the thing you have to remember about Hammer films, they were made for a certain budget and they only had a certain amount of time to do them. So it wasn't like you're going to get Stanley Kubrick or Roman Polanski or somebody to get in there. They wanted somebody who just wanted to they wanted a good film, but they didn't want somebody who's going to go off on some sort of bizarre tangent and spend too much money or take too much time. They they had very specific things that they wanted done, and Gilling knew that. He worked for Hammer for a number of years. He knew what needed to be done, and he knew how to make a film that showcased what Hammer wanted.
Hmm.
And Plague of the Zombies doesn't. Another reason it doesn't get a lot of attention. It doesn't have Peter Cushing or Christopher Lee. It doesn't have one of the big Hammer ladies. It stars Andre Morel, a very great British supporting actor who he's in Bridge on the River Kwai. I think he's in Summertime with Katharine Hepburn. He was a friend of David Lean's, but he did a lot of work for Hammer. And he's one of these great British character actors that Hammer used over and over again because they knew these guys would come in, they would know their lines, they would give an excellent performance. They didn't have to worry about them causing trouble or complaining or screwing things up on the set. They needed professionals, and Andre Morel was certainly that. And he plays a kind of not so much a Sherlock Holmes, but a professor doctor type of character who finds out about this outbreak of zombies in a Cornish tin mine. And John Carson, another great British character actor, and John Carson his problem was, it wasn't so much a problem, but he sounded just like James Mason. If you watch a movie that John Carson is in and you close your eyes, you swear you're listening to James Mason. So I'm sure that probably didn't do his career very good, or maybe it did. I'm not sure. But John Carson is the aristocratic villain. Hammer had so many of these aristocratic, handsome, dark type of villains that were using the villagers for some nefarious purpose, and they were always after the beautiful Hammer heroine. Excuse me. Now, Plague of Zombies is really fun, and it has a really spooky scene set in a graveyard where the zombies rise up, and it's this was before Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah.
It's really pretty much ahead of its time, I think, in the portrayal of zombies.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I really like about it, it has just this wonderful atmosphere. A lot of it appears to have been filmed at twilight.
Hmm.
Maybe I'm imagining that, but it just
I
seems
think
like
there's a
it's at
lot of day.
twilight.
I think there's a lot of day for night there as well. And
Okay.
you also have to remember, I've never actually been to England, which that's definitely number one on the bucket list. But from what I've been told, and I think Veronica told this to me, 99% of the time in England, the skies are gray. So it may not have been day for night. It may just have
Yeah.
been, oh, we're outside. It's gray out. But yeah, I know exactly what you're referring to in Plague of the Zombies. It definitely has this kind of gray. It's not really morning. It's not really afternoon. It's just kind of neutral look about it.
Yeah. Very underrated movie. Next on your list is a real classic from Hammer. Came out in 1958. Some consider it to be Hammer's finest horror film, and that's Horror of Dracula.
Yeah, that's the one I think even non-Hammer fans know about. That's considered the greatest Hammer film. Very first Hammer Dracula movie, very first time Christopher Lee plays Dracula, very first time Peter Cushing plays Dr. Van Helsing. I mean, it's basically all there. Whenever somebody tells me, well, what Hammer films should I watch for the very first time? I tell them, well, you either start out with The Curse of Frankenstein, because that's really where Gothic Hammer began, or you go with Horror of Dracula, which was called Dracula in England. I mean, I always call it Horror of Dracula because that's how I know it, and I'm an American, so that was the title in America. So,
Sure.
and the climax of Horror of Dracula is not just one of the best climaxes of any horror movie. I think it's one of the best climaxes of any film. Period.
That's the scene where they're in like a mansion, and Cushing takes what, the candlesticks, and
the,
makes
the,
them
the
into a cross.
candlesticks, and he forms
Yeah.
a cross to force Lee back into the sunlight, and Lee disintegrates. And the editing on that is just absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, that's true. One of the things that surprised me when I first saw that movie is how few lines Christopher Lee had. He didn't
Yeah,
speak very much.
it's funny. I wrote my blog one time. I compared Christopher Lee's Dracula to Darth Vader, and actually that I'm sure somebody out there is like, what is he talking about? But that's actually a very good comparison, I think, because both characters have very limited screen time. I think somebody said in Horror of Dracula, Lee is only in the movie like maybe 10 minutes,
Hmm.
maybe even less than that, and you don't think about it that way because his overall presence is so great, you assume he's in the movie constantly. But it's just like Darth Vader. Darth Vader in the Star Wars films, the real Star Wars films, the original trilogy, he has very little screen time.
Yeah.
But it's that overall presence that makes him such a powerful character. And that's the thing about Lee, is that Lee could just stand perfectly still and he could totally dominate a scene.
Yeah, absolutely. It was also pretty nice to see Peter Cushing when he was younger and more athletic.
Oh
He
yeah.
he appeared to do a lot of his own stunts.
Hmm.
He was really dynamic in that movie.
Well, he tried to do that in all of his films, and Peter Cushing is my favorite actor of all time.
Hmm.
And the main reason for that is it's fun to watch him, because he takes these roles where usually the older professor type, doctor type, usually just stands around, and in Universal they would get a younger guy to do all the action stuff, or to do all the heroic stuff, or be the romantic leading man. But Cushing never played it. Cushing basically played it like he was which he was the leading man. He
Hmm.
didn't just tell somebody how to fight the monster. He went out and fought the monster. Like I always tell people, The thing about Peter Cushing is, in Horror of Dracula, he doesn't run away from vampires. He runs after vampires. He goes after vampires in hand-to-hand combat, which, when you think about it, isn't exactly the smartest idea in the world. But because it's Peter Cushing, you totally buy into it. It's like, yeah, go get him, because that's what he did. That in every single movie, even when he's older in Dracula 80, 1972, he goes right after Christopher Lee. It takes some gumption to go after Christopher Lee,
Yeah.
especially when he's Dracula.
The next film is actually one I have to admit I've not seen. I've heard of it and I know a little bit about it, but it's Quatermass in the Pit, which came out in 1967. First off, tell me what's the storyline? What's the plot here?
Well, Quatermass in the Pit, that's the third Hammer. That's the third Quatermass film that Hammer made. They're all based on television miniseries that were written by a British author by the name of Nigel Neal, and that's basically where Hammer horror started, because the Quatermass experiment got a lot of publicity for the BBC when they ran it. So Hammer did the film version of that, and that basically started Hammer not on the English Gothic, but started them on science fiction and horror. And they did Quatermass 2, which was back in the 1950s. They always meant to do Quatermass in the Pit. For whatever reason, Hammer never got around to it. They just couldn't fit it into their schedule. And Quatermass in the Pit, the movie version, which was written by Nigel Neal, he adapted his TV miniseries. And I have seen the TV miniseries. Josh Kennedy bought it for me as a Christmas present one year. And it's pretty good, but to me, I think the film version is a lot better, because Nigel Neal took the miniseries and he basically pared it down to its best parts. They're doing some construction in the British Underground Railway, and they come upon a spaceship, and you find out that the Martians have essentially colonized Earth thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, and technically we are the Martians. That's a famous line from Quatermass in the Pit, and it was directed by Roy Ward Baker, and it's not a Hammer Gothic. It's set in contemporary times, 1960s England, but the way it's done, it's done totally straight. There's no sense of, this is a joke, haha, this is funny. That's one of the great things about Hammer. Not all their films are great. Some of their films are sometimes unintentionally funny, but they did everything in a totally straight manner. And Quatermass in the Pit is considered by a lot of people to be one of the best science fiction films of all time, not just Hammer films. And yeah, Bruce, if you get a chance to watch it, I know TCM shows it every so often. It really is a great film.
Yeah. Now, Quatermass is a professor, a scientist.
Yeah.
And he's very hard line, very serious, doesn't have a lot of patience with other people, right?
Yeah, in the first two films, he was played by Brian Donlevy, the American character actor, because back in those days in the 1950s, Hammer tried to get an American. It was usually a fading American actor, but they would try to get an American actor to headline their films so they could get it shown in America, get it shown in the United States. And once they started doing the English Gothics and they used Cushing and Lee, they sort of had their own stars, their own repertory company. They didn't really deal with getting American actors. In Quatermass in the Pit, Quatermass is played by Andrew Keir, a Scottish actor. He was in a ton of movies. Like, I think he's in Cleopatra. I think he's in Fall of the Roman Empire, things like that. But Andrew Keir, he plays Quatermass a little bit, I wouldn't say softer, but a little bit more personable than Brian Donlevy did.
Okay. So it's a ways an apocalyptic film?
In a way, kind of. I don't want to tell everything about it for people that haven't seen it, because I really, that to me is one of the best Hammer films. It's just the way it's done. You totally believe this situation, and the way Neil wrote it, just the idea of the fact that we may be descended not from apes but from aliens. I know a lot of TV shows and a lot of movies have done that. I know X-Files somebody said that X Files is basically Nigel Neal on steroids, and that's a pretty good way of thinking of it.
Yeah.
But and of course, Nigel Neal doesn't get a lot of credit, especially in America, because most Americans don't even know who he is. But it's a great science fiction film because it makes you think, and
Yeah.
that's what the best science fiction films do.
Well, I did watch the trailer a couple of times, and it seemed like a pretty frenetic and frenzied film. So I'm looking forward
Yeah.
to watching that. Again, that's Quatermass and the Pit from 1967. And then the one final Hammer film we wanted to talk about with you, Dan, is really an underrated movie. One of the better vampire films that Hammer produced. And from 1960, it's Brides of Dracula.
Yeah, that's my favorite Hammer film of all time, and I think the main reason for that is that's my favorite Peter Cushing performance. He Dracula is not in the Brides of Dracula, and I know some people just that drives them crazy. There's at the beginning of the film, there's some narration, and it says Dracula, king of all vampires, is dead. And every time I hear that, I want to say the end. It's like the meme where you just put the end and that's it. And I'm sure people who watch the film for the first time, they're like, well, if Dracula's dead, why do they call? It's about a disciple of Dracula, and but the lead character of the story is Van Helsing. I mean, they probably should have called the film Van Helsing. Of course, back then they weren't thinking of it that way. They just wanted to make another Dracula movie. And there's all sorts of legends and urban legends about, well, why didn't they have Christopher Lee? And I, we could spend 3 hours talking about that. Who knows what the real story is behind that? But to me, that to me is the ultimate Peter Cushing role. That's in my mind. That's what I think of when I think of Peter Cushing. I mean, he's the monster fighter. He's the guy that he's going to go out and defeat evil. And if he has to, once again, if he has to go out and fight vampires in hand to hand combat, that's what he's going to do. And the way he does it, he as Bruce has said, he's so dynamic in it, and he's so charismatic. Cushing was trained on the British stage, so he's very articulate. He's very precise in his diction and his dialogue, but he has this physicality that enables him to enhance whatever he does. He's
Yeah.
not just a British stage actor who's just going to stand around and look cool and have perfect manners. He's going to go out and, like I said, he did most of his own stunts. If he was able to do so, he would do it. That's what he preferred to do. I think Peter Cushing's the greatest monster fighter in movie history, and that covers a lot of ground. But in Brides of Dracula, I think he's just fantastic. It's that's my favorite role of his, and it's Brides of Dracula to me also. That's the epitome of Hammer films. The color, the cinematography by Jack Asher. He was the cinematographer that worked on all the early great Gothic Hammers,
Hmm.
and Hammer unfortunately quit using him because he took too long, which once again that just shows you how limited the budget and limited the shooting times were on these Hammer films.
Yeah.
The art direction by Bernard Robinson. It's just the look of the film. It's especially if you see it on Blu-ray or you see a remastered version. I think even when Svengoolie shows it, he shows like the new remastered version of it, and it just looks absolutely fantastic. If once again, if somebody said, "What is your definition of Hammer films?" I would say The Brides of Dracula, even though Christopher Lee's not in it.
Yeah. No Lee, no Dracula, but David Peel is the lead vampire, a little known actor,
Yeah.
surprisingly good here.
Oh yeah, yeah. He's a Baron Meinster, and his vampire is very different than the Christopher Lee interpretation, which had to be. If he tries to be Christopher Lee, it's not going to work. So they came up with something different, and once again, I don't want to give too way too much of the storyline, but it's just the way the story works, and how the Baron Meinster is how he's able to worm his way into what he needs to do, and the whole confrontation between him and Cushing at the end. It has a burning windmill. I mean, what more gothic can you get than that? I'm sure Tim Burton, Sleepy Hollow. I'm sure he was a Brides of Dracula fan. So
Oh, nice. This has been so interesting. I'll be honest, I have a lot of catching up to do on. Hammer horror films. I have made notes, as you can tell, notes as you've been talking. So my watch list is now growing. So I think my movie that I'm gonna watch is the Quartermass and the Pit, just because I'm so into sci-fi. So I think I'll start with that one on my watch list. So that's been awesome. Um, can you maybe just take a few minutes and chat with us about your blog? Like, tell us what it's
Sure.
called and how you got started into blog writing.
Well, my sister-in-law Heather, my brother Robert's wife, she told me this is like 10 years ago. She said, you're such a movie buff. Why don't you write a movie blog? And I'm like, oh, God, there's so many of these things. It's like, what, why? And I just started writing it, and I think I've got like over 1,200 entries, which is, I'm kind of like, wow. I wrote so many of these things, and I sometimes wonder if somebody actually reads it. But I've made some connections. That's basically how Josh Kennedy and I got to really know one another.
Oh, wow.
It's called the Hitless Wonder Movie Blog. That's a baseball reference. If I'm a White Sox fan, and the 1906 White Sox were known as the Hitless Wonders because their batting average was terrible. They barely scored any runs. But this is 1906, and as Bruce will tell you, they basically used the same ball and the same, throughout the entire game. It was called the dead ball era. But anyway, the Hitless Wonder was just something I came up with. You got to call your blog something, and I wanted to do something original and sort of off kilter, and that's what I came up with. So.
Oh, very nice. Oh, how cool. So you've been spending time on that. Do you do any other like hobbies? Is there anything else that you would like to chat about to promote your work, the stuff that you do?
Um, well, I collect stuff. You might see it behind me.
Hmm.
Figurines. I spend way too much money on Blu-rays and DVDs. Um, I've done some voice work for Josh Kennedy and his films. I was in a very, very, very small part in House of the Gorgon. Um, I'd like to do some more of that. Anybody needs a goofy-looking guy from Indiana, I'm available. But yeah, basically, I'm just like a regular. If there is such a thing as a regular geek, I guess that's me.
That's a good term though. We can be geeks together.
Yeah.
I'm a big sci-fi geek too, so
The one thing I do have to say about the blog, I don't just write about science fiction and horror films. It's just
mhm,
whatever films happen to I happen to see, or just something that piques
right.
my interest, and I try to keep it concise. Because one of the things I know, when people read something on a screen, whether it be on a laptop or an iPhone or whatever, they have a tendency to scan through it. So the more and more words you put on it, you know people are just gonna just gonna blow it off, or just gonna scan through it. So I try to be as concise as possible. The more wordy, and I've read some people's blogs where they just go on and on and on. So I try to I try to stay away from any flowery language. I'm not going to be like H.P. Lovecraft and use some word where you have to go in the dictionary and look at it. So I try to stick to the basics.
For those who
Oh,
want to
nice.
read the blog, they can Google Hitless Wonder Movie Blog, or they can go to the URL, which is dandayjr35.blogspot.com. And I'll read that one more time. dandayjr35.blogspot.com. Now, Dan, I know what the 35 means, and
I
some other
figured
people
you did.
might know. What is the 35 for?
That's for my favorite baseball player of all time, the greatest White Sox of all time, Frank Thomas, the Big Hurt.
Yeah. You ever met him?
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
I've met everybody except the people I haven't met. So, but no, I've met Frank Thomas. And here's some trivia for you. Um, Peter Cushing was born on May 26th. Christopher Lee, Vincent Price, and Frank Thomas were born on May 27th. So,
Wow.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, for those who believe in numerology, there's something to that there. Yeah. Hey,
but no,
Dan, final question
that's
for
Frank,
you.
Frank Thomas's uniform number. I probably didn't even mention that. 35.
Yeah,
Was
35.
Frank
Yeah.
Thomas's number.
All right, Dan, last question. This year's Monster Bash coming up in July. It's the weekend of July 19th to the 21st. You planning to be there?
Yeah, I'm planning to be on at both Monster Bashes. I think I can say this now because it's on the Monster Bash website. The Fall Monster Bash, which is the weekend of November 1st to the 3rd, Joshua Kennedy is going to be an official guest.
Nice.
And tentatively, I think they are going to show House of the Gorgon again. So I'm definitely going to be there for that. And I definitely plan on being in the one in July.
Well, I have to miss the one in July because that happens to be Hall of Fame weekend,
Yeah.
and my boss is not going to let me out of that.
Well, yeah, I could understand that.
Yeah, nobody gets out of Hall of Fame weekend. But I'm hoping to make it to the November one and maybe get a chance to meet Josh if you'll introduce me. So,
Oh yeah, absolutely.
yeah,
You'll definitely notice his presence at Monster Bash. He hasn't been to one in a couple years, and the ones that I've been to, the first thing people tell me because a lot of people know me through my friendship with Josh because for a long time, Josh and I would share a room at Monster Bash, and they always tell me, "Where's Josh at? Where's Josh? Where's Josh?" And he's got so many things going on. He's a filmmaker, and he's actually, I think, teaching film at his local college, I believe, in
nice.
Edinburgh. So, but yeah, he's going to be an official guest. And anybody wants to meet him, or if anybody wants to see me at Monster Bash, I'm the one guy wearing a White Sox hat, so that's me. Or the Peter Cushing shirt. It's what I call my convention shirt. I wear the Peter Cushing shirt like just about every convention I've been to, and the first G Fest I went to, the Godzilla convention in Chicago, I wore the Peter Cushing shirt. And I'm not making this up. There were a couple people that literally walked up to me and shook my hand because I was wearing a Peter Cushing shirt.
Nice,
So,
nice. Well, Dan, this has been a lot of fun. We really appreciate your time over this past hour. Thanks for being with us.
well, thank you. I enjoyed it, and I'd love to come back whenever you need me if I haven't ruined the show already. So,
No, we
You've been
ruined the show
fun.
weeks ago, so we're well past that. No, you did a
okay.
great job. Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it. Our guest this week again has been writer, blogger, and Hammer Films enthusiast Dan Day, and someone that you might just meet at Monster Bash if you go to that event coming up in Pennsylvania. It's really a great convention. Ron Adams and his crew do a wonderful job. We thank Dan for being with us. Of course, we thank Tracy Asteria, co-host and producer, for being with us as well. We thank all of you for joining us in this Museum of the Macabre, and we hope we'll see you again next time right here in the Ghostly Gallery.